How differently can you do the same thing? As funny a question as that sounds, it should always be at the front of a game dev's mind. All games, video or otherwise, live and die on their ability to constantly provide new experiences without needing to stop and explain them on a case-by-case basis. The key to that flow is a concise rule set that still encompasses plenty of choices, and an even court with wide but clearly marked boundaries. There are dozens of areas of design where this overall philosophy applies, but for today we're looking at the most important part of any game, the player's character, or more accurately, characters. You know, I was going to preface this with a section on whether your game should or shouldn't have multiple playable characters, and how exactly to handle them based on the exact sort of experience you're making. After realizing the sheer number of ifs, ands, whens, and unlesses I'd need to cover though, I decided to nix that. That could really be its own essay, and I might tackle it someday, but for the purposes of this video, we'll just assume you're keeping it simple. There's a single large campaign, you can play any character in any level you want, and your choice doesn't affect the win condition in any way. That's not to say nothing here will be applicable to a different game structure, but anything more would be getting a bit off topic. With that out of the way, there are a few things you should do before you start designing movesets, drawing sprites, and laying out stats. The first order of business is to create a character with none of those things. For the sake of brevity, we'll call him the guy going forward. The guy is not an alternate character nor your main character, but the most abstract possible iteration of a character for your game. Imagine a Sonic character who can't spin dash, can't glide, can't fly, and can't climb. It wouldn't be a ton of fun, but you could beat any act in any zone in any official game with this character. Why? Because the guy can run, including up walls and inside loops, jump, roll by crouching with forward momentum, enter a ball state when jumping or rolling, damage enemies from any angle of contact while in a ball, smash fragile blocks and walls while in a ball, and take damage without dying as long as he has rings. If any of those don't sound entirely necessary, that's because some of them won't always be. Essential doesn't need to mean constantly, and it doesn't even need to be 100% mandatory either. That's what you need to be most vigilant for. In a complex game with multiple characters and a variety of mechanics on the character and level end, it can be easy to create a scenario in one stage that completely kills the player's run. Weeding out these roadblocks by hand can be very time-consuming and surprisingly easy to just flat-out forget, among all the numerous tasks of game development. Rebalancing a character or tweaking your engine will almost always spring a leak somewhere down the progression pipeline, so waterproof beforehand instead of scrambling to fix the issue later. In Fredventure, the guy is a character who can run between 3 and 6 pixels per frame, reach a height of at least 8 tiles from the ground, perform at least one mid-air jump, damage enemies up close with at least one move starting up in less than 15 frames, fire at least one type of projectile, perform an invulnerable dodge maneuver, and finally perform some type of ground comb attack. As you'll notice, some of these are written in different colors. A yellow ability is one that the player can get by without, but at the expense of making the game harder than intended. Red means that, in order to clear a full run of any possible gameplay mode, the player will need to use it at least once. Green is actually a bit different. This isn't an ability that the player character needs to beat stages, but an ability characters can have that stages need to account for. Freb himself, for example, only has a single ranged attack. His bazooka has a low rate of fire, a slow reload, and a projectile that isn't blazingly fast, and you can beat the game just fine without pulling it out once. Some characters are far more range-focused, however, meaning enemies capable of threatening the player from a distance do need to exist. If they didn't, combat balance would skew too far in favor of characters with weak melee and lower mobility, but strong projectiles. If you're only adding multiple characters retroactively and started off with an initial main character, that can actually make adding more a bit easier. In a design sense, at least. Not so much in a technical sense, but that's a topic for another day. If you've already built and tested a good number of levels, you probably already have a good subconscious grasp on what your yellow, red, and green abilities are. Then and only then should you start iterating on them. Now that we know what a character in our game can do, should do, and must do, it's finally time to start on the actual characters. Continuing on the theme of starting with the abstract and moving down to the concrete, let's talk archetypes. In the taxonomy of playstyle, archetypes are like families. Bundling together thematically related variants on your core abilities is what gives a character identity, even when it's doing fundamentally the same things as the others. That sense of identity is not only central to selling players on the fantasy of being that character, but it also makes mastering them easier, since all of their actions will reward a specific core behavior. Frub's a typical all-rounder, and that versatility comes in the form of a wide range of attacks that can easily take out multiple enemies in one hit without sacrificing control. Frub's playstyle is incredibly simple and complements his aggressive and confident personality perfectly. Run in, cut loose, and go wild with the unparalleled agility of a cat with a grudge. He rewards a straightforward, improvisational approach with a bag of tricks for every occasion. Drin's an air-focused character. Not only does she have the lowest gravity and terminal velocity, not only does her mid-air boost come in the form of an incredibly powerful glide, but many of her attacks can also be used to hang in mid-air for extended periods of time. While she isn't quite as nimble at low altitudes as Freb, she excels at clearing levels quickly and wields some oppressive surface-to-air and air-to-surface power moves. Drin rewards staying airborne constantly. Roxy trades out a lot of platforming prowess for a lot more power. Her Fire Breath and Molten Tongue Whip both stack on the damage over a wide area, and both can be used while standing, advancing, or retreating. Her Ground Pound move creates a large 360 shockwave of high power and knockback, and her heavy shoulder ram can bully even enemies who are normally immune to knockback. Roxy's built like a playable boss monster, with attacks that are slow to start up but lay out an instant field of destruction that covers half the screen. She rewards timing and careful play with heavy damage. Mindstein specializes entirely in ranged combat. He lacks a true crowd clear and melee option, but by holding the fire button and aiming with up and down, he can strafe around freely and chip away at enemies with a rapid laser shot. With up to 3 omnidirectional mid-air jumps, he's also a highly maneuverable character who can execute very sudden and precise position changes. This unique skill set not only gives him a huge leg up over melee-centric enemies, but also makes him the most unique of the 4 story characters. He rewards a fast-paced, evasive approach. To get an even closer look at how these characters, and the design behind them, work, let's examine one similar action they all share and how all of them do it differently. With the exception of Mindstein, sort of, every main character possesses a ramming-type attack. In a speed-based action platformer, an instant attack that lets you smack into enemies without harming yourself is a no-brainer, but even something as simple as that can have a lot of variety. Freb's ram move is a spin punch. It has 0 startup or end lag, remains active for a good handful of frames, and can be redirected or jumped out of at any point. Contact defeats most small enemies in one hit, with only the sturdiest of foes completely halting its momentum. The attack's supremely convenient, and with a slight upward boost and a weak hover effect, it works just as well mid-air as on the ground. Like Freb himself, it's never the strongest option for any one situation, but it is rugged and ready and full of utility whenever you need it. Drin's ram move is a hip check that takes off with significant speed, floats forward mid-air, and bounces her up and away from enemies on hit. Though it doesn't knock down rows of weak enemies like Freb's, it packs in even more movement and combos into her bath bomb attack if you do need some multi-target damage. This high knockback also makes it a safer hit-and-run tool, and when used against immovable boss enemies, the upwards recoil lets you chain hits together and remain airborne. Roxy's shoulder ram, continuing with the theme of power over mobility, is the most devastating but also the least safe. She throws all her weight straight ahead, plowing through even the sturdiest of foes and inflicting heavy damage. This move doesn't end until it hits the ground though, and while you can slow it down a bit by holding in the opposite direction, you don't really have much control. Mindstein, being the de facto ranged character, doesn't actually have a direct ram move. Instead, his equivalent is a pair of laser discs that he throws in a short boomerang arc. The burst damage dealt by tossing both discs actually does stack up well, but it's not quite as instant as with the other moves, and knockback's very minimal. As with his general design, Mindstein's basic melee attack dishes out good damage over a long range, but requires a bit more caution and forethought to use effectively. All completely different, yet all perfectly similar. All stronger and weaker means to the same end based on different situations. Apply that same philosophy to every ability in a set, and you'll end up with characters that just come together. On that note, though, remember what I said before about how archetypes function by rewarding the player for applying a core idea on top of the basic gameplay loop? That's not just a tip for giving your characters an extra level of polish, it is absolutely essential. A strong character is an enjoyable power trip, and a weak character can be a fun challenge, but one thing a character should never be is aimless. A great example of an awful moveset is Drin from earlier iterations of the game. Before she took on the role of Supreme Speed Demon and Aerial Attacker, Drin's archetype was grab bag of whatever sounded cool or funny or unique. Her abilities included a chargeable wind beam cannon, a much slower lob version of her current bath bomb attack. Its speed and trajectory were controllable based on a needlessly wide array of variables, a command grab which she could use to slowly pick up and throw enemies at each other one by one, a borderline useless high kick move which launched enemies upwards but dealt paltry damage. Its only purpose was to combo into a homing double-fisted volleyball punch that slams enemies into the ground. This one actually could fit into her current archetype, but it's wholly unnecessary. A horn charge which dealt more damage and knockback the faster you're moving on collision. It also stunned her for up to 3 seconds at a time, making it amusing and interesting, but essentially useless. That was the overall theme among all the 24+ attacks that I experimented with giving her. Every single one was basically its own little design direction detour, and that resulted in not only a huge sprite sheet that went mostly to waste, and a poor gameplay experience, but also a character who just never felt complete from a development standpoint. Arbitrary design is unfinishable. All the effort you put in is going towards an undefined goal. It's a completely bottomless resource pit, and anything like that within your game needs to be torn down and rethought from scratch. When developing a game, or really when creating anything, there's a constant temptation to implement ideas just because they sound fun in a vacuum. Ideas aren't fun, though. Games are fun. Good ones are fun because they're satisfying, and they're satisfying because they put you in a flow state where rapid decisions with an obvious impact keep the progress going at a steady pace. Changing gears a bit, let's talk something that absolutely can break your character, but can also just as easily make it, a gimmick. Now there's a word with some baggage, huh? In the world of game discourse, gimmick conjures up images of extraneous systems, overcomplicated mechanics, and differences for the sake of being different. Those are all easy traps to fall into, granted, but what's a trap without some treasure on the other side? I touched very briefly on the idea of character fantasy before, but one-of-a-kind mechanics are what really bring that fantasy to life. For the sake of not dwelling overly on our core cast, let's take a look at some of the game's bonus characters and how a little gimmickry can keep them fresh even within their archetypes. Majo Akai, in her playable form, fills the same basic archetype as Dr. Mindstein. She suffers a bit in melee range, but makes up for that with high aerial mobility and powerful projectiles. The catch? Her aerial mobility doesn't come in the form of mid-air jumps. Instead, it comes from never needing to touch the ground in the first place. Majo's levitation can be adjusted with the up and down keys, and while there is an altitude cap, this ability makes her incredibly strong against grounded foes and traps. She falls very slowly and can jump from any point mid-air, though only once before coming back within range of the floor. Without changing anything about how the game really plays out, this one gimmick transforms the character into something entirely unique. Even with other characters being capable of some limited fly or gliding, Majo is the only one who can remain airborne 100% of the time without exception or compromise. This not only comes with obvious gameplay advantages, but, well, it's cool. It's fun. It gives the player a sense of power and leverage over the game, which really should come with the territory of playing as a boss character. Whether or not it makes winning that much easier in the long run. Now obviously adding powers and mechanics onto a character can make him feel unique, but what about doing the opposite? Characters with unusual limitations can be just as much fun, if not more. The character Planet plays a lot like, just take a look at him. And while he may have the highest speed of any character by far, as well as the unique damage and roll jump mechanic, Planet is really defined by what he lacks. With no dodge, no mid-air jump, and a very paltry moveset that only really helps you slam up against enemies a bit more easily, Planet's designed to snatch away your crutches and force you to play the game like a true classic platformer. One might even say a very specific series of platformers that heavily influence the game's visual story direction and technical speedrunning approach. And that sure ain't all there is to say on the art of designing characters, but it is all that I have to say for now. This'll be my longest video yet, even if not by a huge margin. Like I said in the intro, links in the description if you want to actually keep up to date with what I'm up to, ask questions, or propose ideas. That's all for now, though. Talk at you later.